Hi, everybody, and welcome to Lit Chick. I'm Julie Gerstenblatt. I'm your host today, and we're here with Natalie Jenner. Natalie is the author of two books, the instant international bestseller, The Jane Austen Society, and the newly released Bloomsbury Girls, which I have right here. I'll just tell you that The Jane Austen Society, if you haven't read it, read it, and then get Bloomsbury Girls too. The first book won the 2020 Goodreads Choice Award runner-up for historical fiction and was the finalist for Best Debut. It has a zillion accolades. I won't even go into all of them, and has been sold for translation in 21 countries. And now Bloomsbury Girls, which came out in May, was a June Indie Next Pick and People Magazine Book of the Week, and has also sold for translation in several different countries worldwide. And I believe was just recently listed at number 5 on the LA Times book list for hardcover. Is that correct, Natalie?
Yeah, I just found that out this week. Yeah.
Super exciting and well-deserved. Natalie is formerly a lawyer and independent bookshop owner, which we will talk about, not the lawyer stuff, but the bookshop stuff. She was born in England and raised in Oakville, Ontario, where she lives with her family. Welcome, Natalie.
Hi, Julie. Thank you so much for having me on Lit Chick and A Mighty Blaze. And thank you to everyone that's tuning in right now. I'm really thrilled to be here.
We're so excited. And we have to wish you a happy Canada Day.
Thank you. Yes. Founding of our country. It's very cute how it's very close to July 4th. Basically, both countries get to party for the next 4 days. So it's wonderful.
So do you have any big plans besides from hanging out with us?
No, it's like 90 some degrees here and we have a swimming pool. So it's the pool afternoon, right? So yeah.
A nice dip in the pool in celebration of Canada's being named a self-dependent dominion. Right. Okay, so we are here today to discuss Bloomsbury Girls, but I just have to mention that I loved the Jane Austen Society, and I highly recommend everybody read both. And in part, I recommend them because there are characters from the first book who pop up in the second, and we get to know more of them and their story, which I just love, and I'm going to ask about that too. But first, I just want to say Bloomsbury Girls is your love letter to independent bookstores, the staff that work there, and the wonderful array of people that walk through their doors. Now, can you just tell us a little bit more about Bloomsbury Girls?
Sure. Bloomsbury Girls is set in a very stodgy, old-fashioned, 100-year-old London bookshop. And it actually the action starts right around the beginning of 1950, like I think around January 2nd or 3rd. And it follows the youngest and least sort of settled character from the Jane Austen Society, a former servant girl who will actually manage to complete her schooling, but will lose out on a research position at Cambridge due to being foiled by a less deserving academic rival who happens to be a man. And then when she gets to the bookshop, she has a secret mission that the reader and that I, as the author, did not know about until about page 60. I was like, oh, wait, maybe she's looking for something. So she's going to join these two female staff, Vivian and Grace, who are very different. The three women are very different from each other, but they're all feeling very blocked and not able to kind of go after what they want. And they're going to engage in a bit of a war of the sexes with the many male department heads in the bookshop. I call it Mad Men meets You've Got Mail. There's a bit of a 9 to 5 movie vibe to it as well. And they're going to band together and basically perform a coup and take over the bookshop from the men. And it was just so much fun to write. I had a blast.
It is so much fun to read. And I love these women and their strength and their different characters and the way they come together. And I do think it's very clearly about the war between the sexes in a way, because of the timing being 5 or 6 years after World War II, the idea that in America as well, women really came into their own, leaving the home front to go to help out in places where men had been needed, and now we're off fighting, and women were in industry and in business and helping in so many ways. And then after the war, kind of pushed aside again. And so these three women, well, some in different ways, kind of are like, and looking at them I feel like this book, the bookshop is a microcosm for what was happening in society at the time. You have a lot of the old guard and the men who love to protect the status quo and control things. In If we should just begin with the bookstore owner who has a list of 51 rules, is it? How
Yeah,
many?
I figured that he was so uptight that he would keep going, and then everyone would be like, "Okay, you got it. We're cutting you off at 51. You can frame 51, and that's it."
Right. So can you talk a little bit more about all those characters? And also it is like it's almost like a play, because when you open the book, you see a cast of characters, which is so lovely and lively and fun. And it is not at all confusing for people who might be like, oh, I can't keep them straight. You can. So for me, I guess there's a lot of questions telling us a little bit about each character, how you kept them straight, how you wrote them all, and populated this world.
Yeah, I mean, my characters really just show up and come to me. So when I started the book, I wrote the prologue with Evie, and I knew Evie really well. So I'm writing Evie, and then the next chapter, I just have a character go, "The tyrant beckons." And right away, I picture this woman really unhappy, swinging a tea kettle, talking to the other woman. And I've had a lot of really wonderful jobs in office environments over the years with work husbands and work wives. And I worked as a lawyer, and I've worked in companies of thousands of employees, and I've worked in really small shops too. And I really love that energy of a bunch of very different people at work, having to deal with each other and navigate around each other. So I remember the whole book came about because when the Jane Austen Society released, I was in a pandemic like everybody else. I wasn't going out, and I wasn't able to go to bookshops to see my book when it came out. And I remember really missing bookshops. And I was watching a movie called 84 Charing Cross Road. And in that movie, the owner of the bookshop in the movie, which is played by Anthony Hopkins, has an office at the back of a bookshop that's got a glass wall around it. And I remember thinking, what kind of manager in a bookshop, as someone who's owned a bookshop, wants a glass walled office? Because you can see everything going on, but they can see you. And most shops, the store at the back, like no one's allowed in, right? Like, 'cause it's a disastrous mess of arcs and everything. So that's how Mr. Dutton, as a general manager, kind of sprang to mind right away, is that he wanted to see everything that was going on. He needs to feel in control of his environment. He's going to have a lot of rules. And the characters just started to shoot off rules. Like whenever anything would happen, they'd be like, don't do that. Remember rule number 22. And that was sort of how that idea came about, that he was running a really tight ship. But before I started writing the book, I also found, because when I'm about to write, I like to kind of do this weird thing where I go, I feel like writing about X. And I kind of ransack my own library of DVDs and movies and books to see if I've sort of laid a foundation for research, because it says to me that something that is important to me. And I had found this book called The Romance of a Bookshop. And it's the first 25 years of the London bookshop foils from 1904 to 1929. And in it, it actually had photos of so many different staff members. And there was a master mariner who was in charge of the history department. And there was an entomologist who was in charge of the science and naturalism department. So it had like pictures like this. So I can't figure out the camera is going backwards. So anyways, so that gave me the idea of having a bunch of these different departments, and that the men as well as the women would be blocked, that they would be in a position that wasn't what they really wanted to be doing. Because I'm a former career coach, and for decades I was coaching lawyers and accountants to find their next best opportunity in life. And I really wanted all my characters, men and women, even though there's a war, the sex is going on, I want to explore with each of them, how do you find that next opportunity, and how much we need each other to do that, and how important community and connection with others is. And so each of the characters kind of just came about as I was writing, because Julie, I think the last thing to say is I don't plot or outline in advance at all when I'm writing. So as I'm writing, they just show up, and then I just kind of follow them. But when they show up, I know what they each want. I know everything about them, but I don't know the secrets that they're keeping from other people or for themselves. And I write to find out those secrets.
That is awesome. So if you don't, they kind of come to you as these characters, like knocking on your brain or knocking on the door of the bookshop. I'm here. I work in the history
Like I can
department.
see your little face in the window. Like when
Yes.
Dr. He shows up, like I'm like, oh, there he is in the window. Like, yeah, let me in.
I'm like, Ash, need to go to the basement. Thank you. It's so interesting. But then having these people, you say you write to figure out what they're doing there, what their secrets are, and how they're going to interconnect. Do you ever go down the wrong road path What is that process like?
No, I'm really lucky, but I mean, I'll say that the book that I just finished the first draft of, book 3, was a bit of the beast that slayed me. It was a little bit of my comeuppance of shooting off my mouth about, oh, it just flows. It was like, my God. But basically, what happens is that usually around the quarter mark of the first draft, I hit a bit of a, whoa, wait a minute, is this the right time to reveal this? Is this something that should be revealed later? And so what I do at that point is I do a bit of a chapter map, and I kind of write down on different sheets of paper the different chapters so far, because my books have 30 to 40 chapters, right? So I'll have, like, at that point 15 chapters or 20. I'll write down what's going on and I'll lay them out on the floor and I'll look at it all. And from a pacing perspective, I'll have to regroup or repivot sometimes at the quarter mark and go, no, that's not the right time to reveal that. But other than that, once I'm past that quarter mark, I find it just tends to kind of just keep building. I'm a former lawyer, as I said, so I tend to edit very aggressively as I write. And I will write in the morning for a few hours. I will spend the rest of the day working over what I've written until I'm happy with it. I will not let myself go forward until I'm sure that this is what should be happening. And then the next morning I pick it up again. So that tends to work for me.
That's great. I also write in the mornings. I find that is the best time. And I want to ask about, you mentioned being a bookshop owner, and this is a book about people who love books and work in a bookshop. What elements from real life did you use? And I feel like the book is very meta because it's about people who love books, and if we're reading it, we love books. You worked in a bookshop, and they work in a bookshop. You owned a bookshop, and two of them also want to become writers, one man and one woman, Alec and Vivian. And so I feel like you're also speaking to that experience from your own life and the frustrations and joys there. So there's like a lot of questions in one
Yeah.
but also I know you did want to mention a little bit about the bookshop from the first books, from the first book, and what it was like to take the Chawton, what you learned from that too, from the Chawton.
Yeah. Well, I'll break it down. So with the bookshop experience, I had given up writing completely or trying to get published when I turned 40 after decades of trying. So when I opened the bookshop in my late 40s, I actually never thought I was going to be a writer. When people would ask if I was a writer, I would tell them, I think I wrote in order to open a bookshop one day. But it turns out that I wrote so I could open a bookshop one day, which would then lead to me writing again. And the bookshop taught me a lot about what resonates with readers, especially historical fiction. I was really, really absorbing that people loved Jane Austen, they loved historical fiction. And I think a lot of that kind of got into my writer DNA. But when I was writing this book, I wasn't really thinking actively about kind of returning to my own bookshop days. But afterwards, when I look back on it, because so much of it is a creative subconscious exercise, I could see in retrospect that I was doing a bit of a do-over and that I was getting to vicariously experiencing my characters, the fun of setting up a bookshop. And for anyone out there that owns or has worked in an indie bookstore, it's a bit of an addiction, like having a restaurant. And you kind of like, you always want to be opening a bookshop. So you're always trying to reinvent your space and figure out new things to do. And one of the things I remember being excited about in my time of having my own store was literary events and how much fun they could be and what made them fun. And then I think another thing that got into the writing of this one was when Evie first shows up at the bookstore, she does this thing where she picks up the book and everyone's watching her because she's new to the store, and they watch how she handles the book and touches it. It's a very tactile experience. And one of the things that I had learned from other bookshop owners, but in my own time, is that if you can get the customer to actually pick up the book, you're halfway to the sale. So that is why covers are so important and why we tend to show them, a lot of them, like out or flat on tables or standing up, because just more likely to be able to like get them to touch it. And if you get them to touch it, you're kind of like halfway home. So that was something else that got in there. With the library in the first book, Chawton House had a library of thousands of books owned by Jane Austen's brother and his family for generations. And they got dispersed over the years. And one of the things that the Jane Austen Society turns on is the cataloging of that library by Evie, who's going to show up in Bloomsbury Girls. And what's really interesting about the library at Chawton House, which is a museum that anyone could visit if they went to Chawton, is that it's a record of what Jane Austen would have hung out and looked at over her cup of tea 200 years ago, because she would have gone to visit her brother in the afternoon and she would sit in that library. And I'm part of a very ragtag group of literary detectives now that happened after the Jane Austen Society got published. They reached out to me and asked if I would join, about 30 some people, and we're like writers and auctioneers and academics and historians. And the job of the group, it's called the Godmersham Lost Sheep Society. And the job is to try and find these books from the Knight Family Library and bring them back to Chawton House so that we'll have this great record of what Jane Austen was looking at and reading when she was writing. And the website, I think, is called readingwithausten.com. And you can actually go on that website and you can actually click on the spines of books on the digitalized library wall and pull them out. And then you can open them and see what they really look like in real life inside. It's really cool.
That's awesome. So before the show, Natalie and I were talking about rare books, old books, and the business of book selling and book auctions, because that plays into both of her novels. And I have a first edition of The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde that my parents gave me upon graduation from college. And I love rare books. And I do think it's interesting because in some ways they should be available for everybody, but they are beautiful, fine, lost art. And so you understand the rarity and the value, but it seems that you have found a way to make those rare books available through this website for everybody to enjoy.
For everyone to look at. Yeah, exactly.
Everybody to look at. You mentioned that Evie, it sounds to me like you knew Evie was going to jump from your first book to your second.
No, I didn't. No? I didn't know. So I submitted another book, very modern, involving a rock music festival on a British estate that's also dwindling. And it just kind of got shelved. They were like, we see you writing historical fiction. And this all happened just like a month or two before the Jane Austen Society came out. So when the Jane Austen Society came out and did well, I was on a narcissistic high. I was like, people want to read my historical fiction, right? You're on such a, it's awful. I feel bad for my family. With me. And so basically I remember saying to my agent, I think if I'm going to write more historical fiction, I would like to explore the 50s as that kind of continuing pause or middle world of huge historical seismic change, because that's a fun place to be, because you know what's about to happen with like the women's movement and all those things, and you're writing to set the fault lines for the future in your characters' experiences, but they don't know what's going to happen, right? So it's a really fun, for me, it was so much fun to do that, because with Bloomsbury Girls, I was thinking, okay, these women were able to have these really cool jobs. Then the men come back from war and the women are expected to go back into the home. And at that point, some of their children would be grown. Like, they really would not want to be doing that. And I thought, I bet you that put them in a really bad mood for like a decade. And I wanted to kind of explore that moodiness with some humor in my book. But I didn't know that Evie was going to be, or anyone from the Jane Austen Society would be in this time period. But when I thought about it, I thought, you know what? I'm talking about my characters so much right now on my narcissistic high, and I'm promoting this book and I'm missing them. And Evie would be 20 and she would be just finishing a 3-year degree, and I could have her start her next sort of chapter in life. So I told this to my agent, and my agent said, this is so odd, but your editor just told me that that's what he would like you to write about next. And I lean into fate. I always think that's a sign. So I decided that made sense.
Nice. I'm glad. We're all glad you leaned into fate there. Now, who else came over from Jane Austen, and how did they get there? Or were you
very like impromptu? And it made sense that it would be the couple of characters that do show up in Cameos would be the ones that would have the London life, because this book does not have a moment of Chawton in it. So it made sense that it would be Mimi and Yardley, and that as Yardley works at Sotheby's, Mimi's an actress on the West End, and it made sense that they would be the ones. So when they showed up, it was always very germane and organic for me as a writer. But the minute they would show up, I would be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And I knew Mimi shows up in the epilogue on the phone to Evie, but I didn't know Yardley was going to actually show up in the book. And I remember when he did, I was like, oh, there you are again. And I was like so happy to spend time with him. And like Vivian has nicknamed the staircase going up to the rare books Via Dolorosa, which is like trail or pathway of tears. And that is something that the actual real Haywood Hill bookshop where Nancy Mitford worked in the Second World War, they had named their staircase Via Dolorosa. So I have Vivian do that, and I acknowledge this brazen theft by me as an author of that term. But I just remember when she goes, right this way, we're going to go up Via Dolorosa to the rare books department. And Yardley does this cackle and goes, oh, you nicknamed the stairs. How charming. And I cannot tell you what it was like for me as a writer, because in that moment, he was right back in my life again. And it had been, you know, two years. And it was incredible to have him come to life like that again. And that's one of the great joys, Julie, right, of writing, is your characters and getting to spend time with them.
Yeah, and when they really speak to you instead of you, when you stop being like the puppet master, you know, and you just kind of let them take over, and they do. And I love that Yardley was so Yardley, you know, and Vivian also, like, she's new in this book. And by the way, you don't, you know, for readers, you don't have to read them in
No.
order or
Yeah.
anything. They're standalone novels. And Vivian, but she is so great. Talking about when you said being kind of cranky and angry after the war, she has reason to. They all have pasts
Yeah.
that they bring with them, and trauma and trouble from those past years. And your characters are just so lovable, even in their whatever it is, their pride, their standoffishness, their needs. And so, tell me a bit about Vivian.
So Vivian, it was really interesting because there's one part of the book that's based on a real life anecdote. So everything else is made up. But Daphne du Maurier is going to be a pivotal figure in this book. And this is how Vivian comes to be, because I had bought a rare Mansfield Park edition to treat myself self-congratulatory present for the Jane Austen Society coming out. And it was a 1940s edition of Mansfield Park by Jane Austen with the introduction by Daphne du Maurier. And there was a mix-up at the Rare Bookstore in London that sent it to me in Canada. And they sent me a package instead that had Daphne du Maurier's memoir. Where's that camera? Myself
Right,
when you
yeah.
and it's The Shaping of a Writer. And so I read it, and Daphne du Maurier started to like take up room in my brain. And then I remember whenever I would see her like on Google or whatever, I would like read about her. And I read about a story on a great website devoted to women writers and called somethingborrowed.com. And when I read the story, it was about how there was a young writer in the 1950s who was waiting for a party at Ellen Doubleday's. This is going to sound familiar. And in the hallway, there's a woman, and she doesn't know who she is. And they have a really nice conversation. Ellen Doubleday is late, and they spend some time chatting. And it actually takes several visits for her to realize that it's Daphne du Maurier, and that she herself, this young woman, is a frustrated author. So when I was writing Vivian at the beginning, she just kept scribbling in this green coiled notebook, but I didn't know why. I didn't know she was trying to be a writer. I knew Alec was. And that was one of the surprises for me, was that she was actually secretly trying to be a writer, and she's a very talented one. So Vivian's whole character is sort of a channeling in a way of that real life story with Daphne du Maurier. But her mood and her anger and her feistiness was a real kind of release for me, or therapeutic, I think, release for me. Like, I love that she just said exactly what she thought. And I was really enjoying watching her be a foil to Grace, who I think is more like a lot of women, you know, very patient and kind of listens a lot and gives advice. And Vivian is fun to watch, but she's very flawed, as her flaws make her really fun to watch, but they also can kind of get her in over her head. So as a character, she's sort of a foil to Grace, and inspired by that real life story with Daphne du Maurier. And actually, Julie, I don't know, do you know that she's the main character of my next book?
No, and I was gonna ask you, so now seems like a good time
Yeah.
to tell us about the next, well,
Yeah.
yeah, tell us about the next project, and then we'll go back to talking about
Yeah.
this one. Sure.
Yeah. So,
Set in Rome? Is it set in Rome? I
yeah. So
don't know.
basically, Vivian is going to, as a writer, have a couple of plays bomb on the London stage. It's going to be like, what do I do? And Peggy Guggenheim knows someone. Peggy lives in Venice in real life, and she knows someone working at Cinecittà, the Italian movie studios outside of Rome. And it's set in 1955, and Vivian is going to go work in Rome as a script doctor, but also reckon with the loss of her fiance in the Second World War. And there will be a dual timeline a little bit, but it's called Every Time We Say Goodbye. And it's mostly about people having to say a final goodbye to experiences or people that they lost during the war. It's kind of a bit of a conduit, I think, between the mood of the Jane Austen Society and Bloomsbury Girls. And there will be cameos in this one. I got Sophia Loren in there, and
I was going to say, well, Rome Open City. Yeah, Rome Open City, Fellini, all of those. That was the heyday for Italian cinema. Having taken a class in college called Italian Cinema.
Me too, yes. Me too. Same brain. Yeah. I minored in film studies, and I refreshed myself with an Italian film course, but this is my book it's still about storytelling and why we tell stories and who gets to tell the story. And it's also about, I mean, Vivian does take on the Vatican a bit. So she's kind of taking on another male-dominated workplace in a kind of a funny way. So
that is awesome. I cannot wait. Getting back to the cameos, we have Samuel Beckett, Peggy Guggenheim, as you mentioned, Ellen Doubleday, Sonia Blair, who's the widow of George Orwell. How did you decide who was going to pop up and be there, and why? And what's fun or different or interesting about putting the real with those imagined characters up together?
They really chose me. I mean, it all started because I was watching a Netflix documentary on Peggy Guggenheim about the fall of 2019. And somebody just says this line of, oh, and then back in the 30s, Peggy Guggenheim and Samuel Beckett had this torrid affair, and they holed up at the Ritz in Paris for 4 days, and they never opened the door once except to a tray of sandwiches. And I got on my phone and texted my agent, and I said, I have got to write a story one day called 5 Days in Bed with Beckett. And I knew it couldn't happen. I knew I wouldn't be able to do it. I don't have that skill set for a short time frame, two-person, set piece, almost like a play. But I wanted to find a way. So when this idea for the 50s book came up with Bloomsbury Girls, and I was already thinking about Daphne du Maurier because I'd read this book, the memoir on her. And if you know about Daphne du Maurier and do research on her, you very quickly discover that she loved Ellen Doubleday and spent, a lot of time with her in New York. During the trial, there was a plagiarism trial for Rebecca. She stayed with Ellen Doubleday in New York for that. And so it made sense to have Ellen is one of the characters as well as Daphne. And then I was like, here's my chance to slip in that line about 5 days in bed with Becca. So I got those two in.
Yes.
And I didn't know that Sonia Blair was going to show up, but I had done this research and I had learned about George Orwell dying the month that my book is taking place or starts to take place in January of 1950. And Sonia Orwell was a really fascinating character who had worked at a literary journal called Horizon. And she had met George Orwell. He'd fallen in love with her and married her, much older, and married her when he was, dying, like getting, so there was always this controversy around her. And yet the research I did on her was showing her to be this incredible mentor and supporter of talented artists and writers. And I really wanted to explore that as well. In terms of the blending of the imaginary and the real, I always, as a writer, as a lawyer, I make sure that the goalposts are real. So I don't have somebody, I don't have dates that don't work, or I don't have them living somewhere, in the time of my book. I make sure that the bare facts are real. And then I just let my imagination, go crazy. But I did not know how Sonia Orwell was going to come into the book. And the last thing to share was that I had, in my research on du Maurier, learned that there had been a short story called The Doll that she had written when she was 21, and she had tried to get it published in the late 30s. And they think it might have shown up in a journal, but it's being lost. And then it gets lost and no one knows about it. And then around 10 years ago, a bookseller in Cornwall in England finds the manuscript for The Doll, the short story. And I don't know how to say this. I'm always trying to edit myself, but it literally is about a man who's in love with a woman named Rebecca, who lives in Bloomsbury. So it felt like it was meant to be. And she lives in an apartment with a life-sized male doll.
Yes.
And I was like, whoa. And so I was like, I'm kind of forgotten about it. And then I write this scene where Daphne du Maurier is doing this literary event, and this woman stands up and just says 2 words, The Doll. And Daphne du Maurier is like, How do you know about that? And then I went, oh, it's Sonia, and she's working at this magazine, and it's gotten submitted, it's gotten lost, and she knows about it. And it just all kind of felt really like, again, really natural to that moment. And I just went with it. And every time she says the
The
doll,
doll.
I
I
get that little
know.
pull on my back.
I
So
wrote that as a note on my phone, just the doll.
yeah.
But it's so cool. As Shelley just said, wow, that is so cool. And I love that you get so excited about literary mysteries. Like, where did the story go? Like these small things. And I think this is a very British, I've decided you are a very British writer in that you take small moments. There's not like explosions. There's
Mhm.
not, the plot isn't driving in the way that maybe, is maybe more male or maybe more American or more whatever blockbustery, but it moves like it's sort of like we're walking down a country lane, we're having tea, but things are happening. Important things are happening within the subtlety of life, of
Yeah.
real people living their lives and making decisions and trying to find happiness and love. Do you see that as a British sensibility and maybe an Austen in particular sort of
I do
thing?
think it's an Austen sensibility. I think the writers that I love are the writers that are probing the disconnect between our outer selves and our inner selves, and that pressure from society to act and behave a certain way, and then how we really feel. And I don't think there's a lot of room for bodies and freezers, when you're interrogating that kind of space. So for me, somebody recently reviewed the book and said something like, a thriller without a single murder, body, whatever. And what I like is I like to be surprised as I write, because Stephen King once said, if you're not surprised while you're writing, how will the reader be? So I do want the reader to have plot twists coming at them. I do want them to not know for sure what's going on. I do want them to have some aha moments. It's really important to me, because that's what I love when I read. Like, if you ask me what are my favorite books, they can be quite plot heavy. Like, I loved Cain and Abel by Jeffrey Archer when I
Me
was growing up.
too. Me
And, I
too.
love The Thornbirds. I love
Me
Tale of
too.
Two Cities, Count of Monte Cristo, like all these books. I also love Virginia Woolf and Ian Forster, Edith Wharton, Henry James, writers that are probably more the psychological space. But for modern writers, I think I am very influenced by a certain breed of British writer, such as Ian McEwan. Penelope Fitzgerald is a huge influence on me. And not a lot of people have heard of her, but there was a movie with Bill Nighy, and Emily Mortimer called The Bookshop. And I've read all of Penelope Fitzgerald's books. I mean, she won the Booker Prize. It's just that she's a very quiet, subtle writer who writes about these very benign places like a museum or a bookshop, but the malevolence of human need that's driving behavior that's negative it's palpable when you read her. And it really, she's almost like a thriller writer in that way. And I also really love Kazuo Ishiguro, who can jump genres like nobody's business, but especially Remains of the Day. And I love not knowing if you can trust the narrator. I also love that deceptive narrative voice. But to go back to the point about Austen, somebody said recently that if you have a lot of characters, everyone writes different books. Some people write a book from the first person point of view. Some people write a book about two people, one day, the same, the year of the year, the same day, right? It's like One Day by David Nichols, which is one of my favorites. Some people write a book about a small town. I tend to write a book with a lot of characters, similar to Charles Dickens, because I think my goal as a writer in surprising myself is, how will all these people come together? How are they going to connect? And how can I do that unless I have a lot of different people? So this is funny. So I write the Jane Austen Society. I knew I was going to have 8 characters, half men and half women. Okay. And I know this from the start. In fact, I even have it written in this book. This is like the only notes I have for the Jane Austen Society. It's like 6 pages.
Wow.
On the second page, I've written, where's the camera? I am
Over
so
there.
bad. So I've written like what I thought might be some of the characters. Some of them made the cut. Some of them didn't. So Jane Austen Society has been optioned for film and TV. And my agent said to me, with the next book, 8's a lot, maybe try and focus on like 3, like Hidden Figures. I love my agent. He talks about Hidden Figures way too much. So I'm like, okay, good. So I'll start off with 3 characters, and I pitched the book, 3 women in a bookstore, and I start writing. And within the end of the prologue, I've got 5 other characters, right? I've got Mimi. I've got the Stuart Wesley is going to foil her with the
Right.
job, you know. And then so I hand in the book, and there's a cast of like 21 characters at the beginning. So for book 3, they're like, now maybe do it more from the consciousness of one character. And I was like, yeah, Vivian. And I've got like 21 again. And it's because as I write, my entrancement as a writer is these people are popping up and I don't know all their secrets and I don't know how they're going to connect. And I write to find that out. And it's so much fun. Like, I wish everyone could experience this. It's
Yeah. I think that is part of what keeps a story that isn't propelled quite that way interesting, because you're going to keep, maybe you're not moving far in the first book, for example, out of that little town, that sleepy little town, or in the second one, outside of the bookshop. That so much can happen in that space if you populate it with the imaginations and lives of all of those people. So, is the question, was that because if they make these into movies and TV, they have to cast a lot of people? Is that why they wanted to do the limit?
I don't know.
Or
I
for
don't
the
know. I've never
readers?
pinned them down on that. I almost don't want to know the answer
Yeah,
because I'm worried
doesn't
it'll
matter.
affect how I approach my craft. So I just
No, more the merrier. They can, more
yeah.
actors will get parts eventually. And I do hope that they actually actively turning Jane
So
Austen's
the option for the Jane Austen Society, I don't know the status of Bloomsbury Girls, but the option for the Jane Austen Society is in its second year, and they're actively sourcing screenwriters. So they're at the very, very beginning stage. But you know, the one thing to say about my books is the audiobook versions are so excellent. I have both won awards and gotten starred reviews. So I feel in a way very spoiled. I feel that I do have a cinematic or play equivalent of my stories, with Richard Armitage doing the Jane Austen Society. So incredible. And if people go on my website, nataliejenner.com, I have a section on audiobooks, and I've downloaded like a ton of links where you can hear the 2 books, samples from them, because it's just stunning. The next book's set in Italy, but I have British characters because I think I really want British audiobook narrators because I just love that accent. But with the second book, Bloomsbury Girls, Juliet Stevenson did the narration, and they each had like 20 different dialects, classes, different nationalities to do. And it's a skill. And I am very, very grateful that Macmillan Audio, who produces my audiobooks, has landed me truly what are considered to be the best male and female audiobook narrators working today. I'm very, very lucky.
Yeah, I did listen after reading the Jane Austen Society. I had heard how incredible the narration was, so I listened to a little bit of it. It's wonderful. I highly recommend that too. And perhaps you do the first one in audiobook, and then you pick up Bloomsbury Girls to read. I want to ask you a little bit about your. This is kind of off topic, but your writing shed. Do you have a writing? You have a writing shed.
Yeah. Yeah, you can find it on my Instagram feed. It's this little blue shed. It's 8 feet by 8 feet, and it's chamfered, like it's cut at one angle, so it's not a perfect square. So it's not even 64 square feet. It has a peaked roof, and it's totally rainproof. So I actually, in Canada, can be in there from about February to November, and I have a heater, so I actually can go in there in December. But it's really just far enough from the house that people aren't calling out, you know, that family life. And yet I can be, you know, brought cups of tea, I say. And sometimes I bring one of the dogs in with me, and I have like mid-century furniture and a desk, and I keep my books around me. And I find it a perfect place to go and just be far enough away from everyone. And when I look out the windows, I see greenery in our garden, and I find seeing trees are one of my favorite things in life. And seeing all the leaves, I find very peaceful, and it really enables me as a writer to just go wherever my brain wants to go. So.
That is lovely. I love that. I did see that on your Instagram. Okay, we have questions from the audience.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Trisha's popping it up from Anissa. And I don't know if it's Anissa or Anissa, and I do need clarification because I love this woman and I don't know how to pronounce her name. So Anissa, tell us in the chat, how should I pronounce your name? Do your characters lead you or do you lead them?
Oh, they totally. Yeah, that's a great question. Again, this is just a wonderful, wonderful supporter of this book. Thank you so much. very much that they lead me. So when I write, I feel like I'm looking through a camera, and Anissa, perfect. Um, when I write, I feel like I'm looking through a camera, and I feel like my daughter's a novelist as well. And she's doing her MA in creative writing starting this fall. We both say we feel like we're just typing down what we're watching. So I don't have conscious intent while I write. Like, I'm never thinking, oh, I want to have this happen now. I actually feel like I'm watching a film. And that's why if you look at my books, often when a character is introduced, we're observing them as if we're through a camera, which is what I think gives it a bit of a cinematic feel. So they definitely completely lead me. Somebody asked if I've ever had a character show up that I didn't have space for in the book and thought, oh, they're so great, I'll park them. And I was like, no. And I was surprised. I realized that I've never had anyone show up who became less or more than they ended up in the book. That's how much they're driving the plot.
To me, also a question that I had, which is more maybe just a comment, is the difference between Vivian as a writer and Alec as a writer, and that he seems driven by ambition and wanting to be published, wanting to be famous, wanting to be Beckett or the men that he so admires in the literary world, where Vivian writes because she loves it and kind of feels a compulsion to do it and a need, and isn't even sure of what she's writing. And so what you just said about that unconscious, or like sort of leaving yourself and your ego and your pride behind to write, to have that space, feels like what you have given Vivian. And it's, and it's a more of the female that, way that you approached what's happening between these writers in this book. Okay, next question, Trisha. Hi, Shelley. How long does it take for you to write a book, not counting the research?
Up until book 9, I would have said that I do the NaNoWriMo approach, the National November Writing Month, where you do 2,000 words a day and you get your 60,000. So I would say that almost all my books have been written in about 6 to 8 weeks. And that's the first draft. But then I spend a year adding on. So that original 60,000 is going to go to 100,000. So it's going to grow, by more than 50%. And it's all about what more needs to be in here, because I don't like ever having an unnecessary sentence. Now, that may not be how it comes across to the reader, but for me as a writer, I feel that everything I'm putting in there is in there for a reason. And so I very much don't take breaks. I write every day, weekends, and I keep going because I want to find out how it ends. I've also sometimes been known to write the last quarter of the book in a weekend. And Louise May Alcott calls it the vortex. She actually taught herself to write with her left hand as well as her right, because you get so tired. So I've actually been known to throw out my left shoulder from typing for like 2 days nonstop, because I'm so desperate to find out the ending and what's going to happen. And so that's one reason why the first draft happens really fast. The key for me is I used to be a bit like Alec. I want to be published. I will admit it. When I turn 30, I'm going to write a book and I want to get published, and I want to have it on a shelf like this one day. And that was, I love writing, don't get me wrong, but that was a big driver. It's like, I want to do it. I want to make that book happen, right? And what I needed to learn was to forget myself and to write for the audience, for the reader. And the great thing about getting published is I wrote the Jane Austen Society purely for myself and my husband. I never intended to send it out. And when it got published, it was all a huge surprise and a wonderful dream come true. But with Bloomsbury Girls, what was so fun, so I get a little emotional right now, but having the Jane Austen Society do well and knowing there were people that wanted to read my works after 20 years of trying to get published, it really motivates you, because you're like, oh, you have people that are like, I can't wait to read your next book. And I would sit down every day with so much joy in my heart, just a gratitude that there were people out there that wanted to read me again. And so that, I think, really informed Bloomsbury Girls, where I tried really hard to be more like Vivian. But with the mentorship that Du Maurier gives her in the book, I was getting from my agent and my editor and my team at St. Martin's. Like, they were helping me become a better writer. And so, it was my editor that said, why don't we start every chapter with a rule? It was my editor, like, he wanted a cat. I said no to a cat in the bookshop, because he's always trying to sneak an animal in there. But he was the one that said, can we have something at the end where we see them all again, like the end of the Jane Austen Society? So, like, my 5 favorite chapters in the book were ones that I wrote after my editor read the second draft. right? And that's the incredible privilege of getting published, is you have these incredible readers, early readers, other authors in your life that you've made friends with, like Molly Greeley, who writes the most beautiful books I've ever read, The Clergyman's Wife and The Heiress from HarperCollins William Morrow imprint. And they're connected to Jane Austen, but
Mhm.
they stand on their own. And she is the BBC said her writing is like D.H. Lawrence. Like, she's the most beautiful, beautiful lyrical prose. Molly's my first reader. Molly's the only person besides my husband right now that has read my next book. My agent has it now. But so, those are the privileges you get when you get published. And the path up to getting published is to I think as much as possible, not about yourself, but about the person reading the story. And so that has really worked for me.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's clear. And when you wrote about what you learned in the bookshop and how you kind of keyed into those things and figured out, and also I think you found, and now that you have two books and a third coming, and you're an author with um, these expectations from readers, you're probably more sure of yourself as a writer. What is it that you want to say, or that that writers can, I mean, readers can look forward to from, like, what is a Natalie Jenner book? What is it gonna do, say, be? I know what I think it is, but what do you think that is?
I want people to have, first of all, more than anything else, I want to take them out of their life. I want them to be entertained and distracted. That is my number one goal. I want you to miss your subway train. I want you to, stay in the bath too long. Like, I love that feeling of people suspending their life, because I don't know about you, but life is hard. Life is really hard for right now, all over the world. It's always been hard. And what art does is it allows us to disappear somewhere else and come back to our life with new energy and hope. So I want my books to both distract and entertain, but I also want to leave the reader with a sense of what the world could be and hope. And I explore dark themes, but I try not to do it in a really heavy-handed way, because I want that balance there for the reader, that they're still enjoying the story. So for me, each of my books is exploring serious themes, but done through human behavior and human connection and stories of friendship. And I think the last thing in a Natalie Jenner book, besides entertainment and hope, is I do want people to see the value of connection and community, and how important other people are to each other, and how a little bit of goodness goes a really long way. And as a former career coach, I know how important it is to stay open to opportunity and to be curious and kind and to be open to new experiences. And in my books, I always want my characters to learn that lesson. And then I want to show the reader why these are positive, behavior traits in my characters, so that it can fortify us, or maybe recommit us, or remind us of some of the things that can happen when we spread goodness in the world. Goodness is a really important theme for me.
Yeah, I that hope that you just spoke about really comes across, and I do see it in both books. I know that your first novel, there's a quote, I don't know it, I know you must, about hope, or like that I think Evie says, about trying to, just, you don't know what's going to happen, but there's always like the hope that something good will be kind of around.
Yeah, and also, like, I think the favorite line I have from that book, and I remember when it came to me so clearly that I was like, "Oh, I hope this isn't already written," and I Googled it. It was like, that life doesn't give up on you if you don't give up on it. And that my life is a perfect example of that, because, when I wrote the Jane Austen Society, we were coming out of a terrible terminal illness diagnosis for my husband, and he has so far survived the statistics with some experimental drugs. But it was an incredibly painful and traumatic time. And it was so tempting to not keep going forward in life and trying new things and trying new experiences, because life felt very on hold. But I wrote this book and I sent it out. It got published. It's changed our lives. So, it was a good example of the very theme in the book, which is, my husband said, "You've got something here and you need to send this out." And I was like, exactly 4 years ago, I sent it to agents on a Saturday, like July 4th.
Oh, that's terrible
I was
time.
like, the stupidest time, a statutory holiday and a weekend, because I really did not think anything was going to happen, because I'd been rejected, Julie, at that point by 300 agents over 20 years. So I was like, it's, you just have to keep going. as small a way, as big a way as you can handle. And that was the lesson for Adam in the Jane Austen Society.
Yeah.
And the lesson for Evie, I think, in this book as well. You know, Evie, it would be very easy for Evie to just kind of have just retreated and gone back to Chawdin, or not pursued her dreams in the way that she does. It does take doggedness. It takes a huge amount of hope, but it comes back at you. And sometimes it doesn't come back in the way we think, but it does come back. So,
Well, I feel like that's it, folks. There is really nothing else that we can say, because it's such a beautiful way to end this interview with this conversation about literature, what it does for us, what books bring us, the joy of reading on your own, but also the community that's created through books. And talking to Natalie today, you have been such a joy, and it's been an honor. And I just want to say thank you, everybody. Everybody's saying so wonderful. Thank you both, and thank you for your perseverance, Natalie. So inspirational. I couldn't agree more. And that is a perfect way to send you off for your Canada Day festivities in the pool in the backyard, and for us here in America for hopefully a really happy and much needed 4th of July celebration. So we'll see you next time on Mighty Blaze, and next week on Lit Chick, same time, same place. Bye, everybody.